I'm a pretty driven person. I think you could say that. I went to Ben Davis High School, and I graduated in the class of '97. Go Ben Davis Giants! Hey, Sarah, where's my memorabilia box from high school?
Somewhere in the basement. Probably the closet, like at the bottom of the stairs.
All right. I graduated in the top 20 in a class of 900. I worked, well, kind of hard to do that. At least I think I earned it. And then I went off to Wheaton College, which is sometimes called the Harvard of evangelical schools. In my first semester there, I took this class called Dynamics of Spiritual Growth. It was a class about, well, growing spiritually. And I got my lowest grade of all of my time at Wheaton. It was a B-. Now, ever since I've taken that class, I have read and reread those books over and over again. Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster, The Great Divorce and Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer by C.S. Lewis, The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. Perhaps every time I read those books, I am trying to earn a better grade. When I went off to seminary, I went to Duke University because of the professor, Richard Heitzenreiter, who was a world-class John Wesley theologian at the time. By the way, this is not a bust of John Wesley. That's Francis Asbury. I had a bust of John Wesley up until a couple of minutes ago when I dropped it and it cracked on the floor. I got a fellowship at Duke that paid for all of my studies there. But because of that, I felt like I had to earn it. So I threw myself into serious hard work. Now, Duke was really awesome, but it also instilled in me some pretty negative ways of interacting with myself and grading my performance, even my own self-worth. In my first John Wesley exam that I took, under the professor that I went to Duke to study under, I got my lowest grade of my seminary experience, another B-. I remember driving home with Sarah to our house, and I had to pull over on the Durham freeway because I just bawled my eyes out on the side of the highway. Now, all of this stuff, all of this memorabilia, all of these grades, they're all relegated to a couple of shelves, some files, a box of memorabilia in the bowels of my basement. So graduation Sunday, yay, congrats! You've earned it. Hey, here's a question I want you to talk about. What has been your experience of earning something? Like, for example, a graduation. Let's talk about that. All right, friends, we are in week 2 of a series that we call a belief series. It's about what we believe, why we believe it, why you might want to believe some things and not other things. And there's a challenge whenever we do a series like this. We take the muzzle off of me and Pastor Mark, and we let us sort of geek out for a couple weeks on things that we think are really important that maybe sometimes you don't spend as much time thinking about. So here's the challenge through this whole series, is to take a sort of academic topic, an academic book, and make it really engaging, and especially engaging today to our graduates. That's the challenge, all right? Challenge accepted. Boom goes the dynamite. Let's get into this. So this whole series is based on a book by a guy named Justo Gonzalez. He's a Cuban-American Christian historian and a Methodist pastor, and it's about St. Augustine. The title of the book is the mestizo Augustine. Now, the word mestizo means a person of two cultures. Now, Augustine was a man of two cultures. He was from North Africa, so he's got this African foot that he stands on sometimes. But he also was trained in Rome, so he's got this Roman foot that he stands on sometimes. And these two end up being kind of ancient rivals, sort of the North African rival and the European rival. I mean, that still sounds familiar today, right? Today's ancient rivalry is Britain versus Africa. Law and works versus grace. Here's the question of today's big rivalry. Do we work to earn God's love and salvation, or is it a free gift of God's grace? In one corner of this ancient rivalry, hailing from the British Isles, is Pelagius. Now, Pelagius was born in Britain, but his parents sent him to Rome to study law, and then he moved to North Africa, where Augustine was from, before moving on to Ephesus in Greece, and then eventually dying in Egypt. Pelagius' parents sent him to Rome to study law, but while he was there, he lived a very monkish lifestyle. No, not like a D&D monk. More like a medieval monk. In the other corner of this ancient rivalry, hailing from North Africa, St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo! Now, Augustine and Pelagius actually overlapped in time in Rome, but they never met each other while they were there. While in Rome, Pelagius heard Augustine's confessions read, "Give what you command, and then command whatever you will." When Pelagius heard this, he thought, does this mean that if we sin, God has not given us the power to not sin? Or is God to blame for our faults? Or is God to blame for our disobedience? Or do we work to earn merit and our own graduation into salvation? Pelagius doesn't have a very big platform or many followers, but the hits the fan when his disciple and follower Celestius tries to tag in and be ordained in Carthage, and in the process is deemed a heretic. Augustine, on the other hand, had the bigger platform. He was the most prominent bishop in the region, and he had the most followers. At the Council of Ephesus in 431, after both Augustine and Pelagius were dead, Pelagianism was deemed a heresy. By that point, Pelagianism meant Pelagius and Celestius and their followers. Now here's where the debate begins. It's with this question: does sin get passed on to one's descendants? Now remember, sin is intentionally or unintentionally missing the mark. Does Adam and Eve's sin get passed on to one's descendants? For Pelagianism, Adam and Eve's sin does not get passed on to one's descendants. Now this has ramifications for our guilt and whether we earn our salvation or whether it's a gift of grace from God. Pelagius says that a stone that falls does so because of its nature and is not to blame for falling, but a stone that is thrown does so because somebody threw it and it gains no merit in the throw. If we sin because of our nature, we don't earn any blame for it. But if we do good because of God's grace, according to Pelagius, we don't earn any merit for it either. To say otherwise would be to make God an unjust God who blamed us for things that we could not do, and who gave us merit for things that we did not earn. Now remember, Pelagius trained in Rome under Roman law, which taught this basic principle. It's called the principle of possibility. If there's no possibility of obedience, then there's no guilt for disobedience. For example, a slave is not culpable for breaking a law that the master commanded the slave to break. The master was culpable for breaking that law. Pelagius argued, if sin is unavoidable, it's not sin. If a commandment is not obeyable, it's not a true commandment. A just law must be obeyable, and a just judge must not punish someone who had no ability to not follow the law. He would point to St. Paul's letter to the Romans, where Paul says, the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who do such things. Because they had the possibility both to do them and to not do them. Now here's a question I want to ask you. Do you feel like sin is avoidable or unavoidable? And why? Let's talk about that. So Gonzalez sums up Pelagius in this way. All of this means that merit as well as guilt is to be based on the exercise of free human will. Those who act according to their own will deserve a reward or a punishment, but those who do so by nature or moved by God deserve neither one nor the other. Or a little further on, he sums Pelagius in this way. God gives grace to those who ask for it and deserve it, and not to those who do not ask for it or deserve it. You could sum Pelagius up in this way. You work to earn God's salvation. God is like Angelica.
Eliza, I'm looking for a mind at work. I'm looking for a mind at work. I'm looking for a mind at work.
Looking for somebody at work to earn God's favor. Right about now, you might be thinking, Pastor Thomas is convincing us to become a follower of Pelagius. I mean, it all makes sense. But there's one really big problem, and that is that what Pelagius teaches, according to Augustine, goes against a lot of the Bible. For example, Paul in Romans chapter 5 says, when Adam sinned, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. Now, 200 years before Augustine was even born, Tertullian, another African Christian leader in Carthage, first proposed that sin was inherited. Augustine didn't invent this out of nowhere. In fact, what he ended up doing was popularizing for the Western Church an idea that almost all North African Christians already held, that sin was an inherited condition. This idea wasn't new to Augustine. Now here's something that's really interesting to me. 2,000 years before it was even discovered, it sure sounds like Augustine and Pelagius are having a debate about whether traits are passed on from one generation to the next. Of course, today we know that in many ways they are through DNA. Characteristics are passed down, both our good stuff and our bad stuff. So we're back to this basic question. Is God to blame for our sin? Do we work to earn God's love and salvation, or is it a free gift of God's grace? From the perspective of the Pelagians with their background in Roman law, Augustine's God was unjust and capricious. Augustine, the mestizo, while understanding the concern of the Pelagians over justice, feels that the Pelagians are trying to limit the power and the authority of God. In this debate that ranged across the entire Roman Empire, Pelagius is labeled a most Latin man, aka Roman elite, while Augustine was labeled a Punic man, aka uneducated African. Does this rivalry sound familiar? Well, over time, the quote, uneducated African wins most of the debates. In fact, you may not even recognize it, but much of the way that you think about Christianity is influenced by Augustine and this debate that he had with Pelagius. Now here's how Augustine wins. He develops this idea of concupiscence. Now usually when we think about concupiscence, we think about it as sexual sin. But that's not what Augustine meant. Concupiscence means to love the wrong things too much and the right things too little. Concupiscence is every disordered earthly appetite that turns us away from love of God, not just our sexual appetite. Alongside of concupiscence, Augustine also begins to think very deeply about God's grace, or God's help for overcoming concupiscence. Augustine develops a very illuminating metaphor for thinking about this. We are not, of course, helped by God to sin, but we cannot do what is right or carry out the commandment of righteousness in every respect, unless we are helped by God. The body's eye is not helped by light so that, closed and turned away, it may withdraw from the light. Rather, it's helped by it to see, and it cannot do so at all unless the light helps it. In the same way, God, who is the light of the interior human being, helps the sight of our mind so that we do something good, not according to our own righteousness, but according to His righteousness. But if we turn away from Him, that is our fault. then we are wise according to the flesh. Then we consent to the concupiscence of the flesh with respect to what is forbidden. Augustine creates a systematic way of thinking about God's grace, about God's help in overcoming our disordered desires, our concupiscence, the way that we love the right things too little and the wrong things too much. This is why Augustine is often referred to as the Doctor of Grace. No. That's Doctor Who. I'm talking about the Doctor of Grace. So Augustine has thought deeply in this rivalry with Pelagius and reflected on the Bible and what it has to say, and he's developed this idea of first concupiscence and second God's grace or help in overcoming concupiscence. But now we ask the question, how are we responsible or not for our sin? And at this point, he reflects more deeply on our free will. Our free will is our own responsibility for dealing with our concupiscence. Free will is the ability that we have to act out of ourselves. So here's how Augustine thinks about free will. First of all, Adam and Eve are created in the Garden of Eden, and humanity's freedom is limitless in the garden. We are free to not sin, and we are free to sin. After sin enters into the world, our freedom becomes limited toward and within the negative. We are not free to not sin, but we are still free to sin. Our field of freedom is limited. We're free for certain things and not for other things. For example, humans are free to walk on the ground, for example, but not free to fly in the sky. I know. Some of you are saying, but what about planes? Remember, we're talking about the 4th and 5th centuries here. Now, here's something that's really important to understand. While our freedom is limited, inside of the freedom to sin, not all sin is equal. We have a freedom to choose one of many paths in a sinful sphere. Not all paths are equally sinful. Some do more harm than others. For example, sneaking a cookie versus a school shooting. Now, the good news is that in Christ, there is a restoration of the human being. There's a restoration of our freedom. We regain our freedom to not sin, to act virtuously, and we still have the freedom to sin, which unfortunately we act in all of the time. Now, Augustine would point to St. Paul in Romans chapter 5, and here's where he takes all of this from. And the result of God's gracious gift is very different from the result of that one man's sin. He's talking about Adam. Yes, Adam's one sin brings condemnation for everyone, but Christ's one act of righteousness brings a right relationship with God and new life for everyone. Because one person disobeyed God, many became sinners. But because one other person obeyed God, that is Christ, many will be made righteous. Because of Jesus' faithfulness, we are saved. We didn't earn it. Jesus earned it. Jesus did the work to earn our salvation for us. Now here's where things get really cool with Augustine. In eternity, the sphere of our freedom is once again limited, but in a positive direction rather than a negative one. We still retain the freedom to not sin, but we lose the freedom to sin. Now, we're not there yet. We still have the freedom to sin. And Paul speaks about this as he goes into the 6th chapter of Romans. He says, well then, should we keep on sinning so that God can show us more and more of his wonderful grace? Of course not. Of course not. Here's how Augustine puts it in his own words. Thus, the original freedom of the will was the possibility not to sin, but the final freedom will far exceed it, for it will be not having the freedom to sin. The original immortality was in being able not to die, but the final will be not to be able to die. So how do we take the first step if we are not free to not sin? How do we take that first step back towards God? God's grace enables us to take that first step back towards God, to regain in Christ the freedom to not sin. Without God's grace, we are not free to move from the state of inherited sin to the state of redemption. Or as John, one of Jesus' closest followers, says, we love because God first loved us. Pelagius says, "Sinner, heal thyself." But Augustine, the doctor of grace, says, "Sinner, find a physician." You see, we have the freedom to become sick, but once we're sick, Augustine says, we need a physician to help us regain our health. So here's a question I have for you. When was a time you got sick and needed help outside yourself to heal you? Let's talk about that. One of the things I love about having these conversations in the chat box with you all is that there are a lot of perspectives, and this debate between Augustine and Pelagius, there's a lot more to it than what we're talking about today. For example, can you resist God's grace? Is it irresistible? Augustine says, no, you cannot resist God's grace. Are only some elected to receive God's grace? Augustine says, yes, only those who are predestined, the elect, receive God's grace. The non-elect do not receive God's grace. Now, Pelagians contested this bitterly, and people contest it even to today. The Pelagians argue that people are condemned at no fault of their own. In this debate, Augustine brings his African view of authority to the table. Who are we to question God? I mean, God is God. But Augustine is a mestizo, and so in other instances, he brings his Roman view of authority to the table. We're going to talk about that in future episodes. In 529 at the Synod of Orange, no, not that kind of orange, Christian leaders sat down at a table, and they continued to condemn Pelagius as a heretic, but they didn't affirm Augustine's idea of predestination in the elect. 12 centuries later, the debate continues. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement and the priest in the Church of England. Yeah, I know, that's not John Wesley. That's actually Francis Asbury. You remember John Wesley's bust was busted on the ground a couple of minutes before I started filming this message. John Wesley was a contemporary of George Washington's, although on different sides of the ocean. And John Wesley made this claim that grace is available to all and it is resistible. The elect, John Wesley said, are those who respond to the grace of God through the faith and the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Wesley went on to build on the work of Augustine, the doctor of grace, with his own different conceptions of grace. There's prevenient grace, the grace that is there before you even know it. There's convicting grace, the grace that convicts you of your error. There's justifying grace, the grace that pardons you, or regenerating grace, the grace that makes you into a new creation. There's sanctifying grace, which perfects you in love, and glorifying grace, where you are no longer free to sin. Does that sound familiar? Augustine and Wesley both built on this idea of grace, a sort of means of grace or channels by which God's grace is infused into us. You can think of these as where God said God would show up. In baptism, in communion, in reading the scriptures, in prayer, in church service, in worship. These are places, these are means of God's grace, channels that are infused with God's grace. What has been a means of God's grace for you? Through what channels have you encountered God's grace? Let's talk about that. Well, congratulations, graduates. You have earned it. You've worked hard, you've put in the long, hard hours, and some of you have the grades to prove it. But here's the point of today's message for you, especially at this graduation turning point. There's like a ton of flaws in our education system, but one of them, particularly when it comes to your spiritual life, is equating what you had to do to earn your grades, to earn your graduation, to earn your kind of acceptance into college or academia with the way that God's grace and love work. You see, all of the work that you've put into everything you've done up to this point, at someday it's just going to be a box of memorabilia in the bowels of your basement. It's going to amount to that. In fact, my box, as you saw, wasn't even fully full. But know this, there's nothing that you can do to earn the grace of God. There's nothing that you can do to earn the love of God. There's nothing that you can do to make yourself more beloved. Whether you are graduating with a 4.0 or whether you've just graduated with, C minuses, or whether you didn't even graduate, whether you're going to college or graduate work, or whether you're going to work with your mind or with your hands, none of that makes you more beloved in the eyes of God. What God's grace does for us is it gives us the capacity to wake up to this reality, the reality that there isn't anything you can do to earn God's love. In fact, Jesus has done everything already necessary to earn everything that's really important. Jesus gave his life. He paid the ultimate price for you and for me. Jesus paid for everything that's already worth buying. You don't get your life together to come and receive that gift from Jesus. No, you receive that gift from Jesus to get your life together. And like any good gift, it's best received in community. I mean, who wants to open up a gift and not share it with anybody? Who wants to open up a gift and be totally by yourself? That's no gift at all. The gift that Jesus gives us is best received in a community of followers of Jesus. Graduates, as you graduate from high school or college or whatever setting it is, and perhaps you move out of your parents' home, find that community of followers of Jesus to receive the grace of God together. That community of friends who will be a means of God's grace for you, a channel of God's grace into your life. So what's the first step towards that gift, receiving that gift? Well, it's simply talking to God. Saying something like this: God, I confess that my love is disordered. I have loved the wrong things too much and the right things too little. I have not acted with love or justice or mercy or humility in all situations. I have acted in my own selfish interests, looking out for number one. Forgive me, God. Forgive me for all of those things and reorder my love. Give me the grace to be transformed that I might love the right things in the right proportion. Help me to find a community of followers for that lifetime commitment, that lifetime journey of following you and being transformed until the one day when we will no longer be able to sin, when we will no longer be able to not love rightly or to do injustice. Oh God, quicken that day in my life and our life together. In the name of Jesus and in the power of your Spirit. And all who agreed, said or typed or used the prayer emoji, Amen.